Okay, today we are talking about unlocking quirks as superpowers. If you want to tweet at me or write to me, here are my handles up here. More than happy to engage you in conversation. Before I jump into it, I want to tell you a little story that gives you a sense of my background and why we're here today. And I want to tell you about a bus trip that happened a couple years ago. So the year is 2013. I was living in Jersey City at the time, but I commuted to Philadelphia just about every weekend because that's where my family was located. And on this particular weekend, I was on my way back to Jersey City, and I picked up one of the free newspapers, like City Paper or Philadelphia Weekly, and I was reading it while I was waiting for the bus to leave. And I came across this really fascinating article about a man who had struggled most of his life with social interactions and communications, including being able to relate to other people, holding down a job, things that most people probably don't think about. And as I was reading the article, the author did a really good job of including a list of his symptoms. And I'm going down the list, because it's a good article so far, so I kept reading. By the time I got to the end of the list, I realized I had just about every symptom on that list. Turns out the condition that he had was autism. Full name, autism spectrum disorder, becomes adult autism spectrum disorder if you're diagnosed with it as an adult. This is a great slide from a website called Autistic Mama. That's autisticmama.com. And these are what you might call quirks, things that children may have exhibited that seemed a little bit off, but probably not setting off alarm bells on an individual basis. But when you put them all together, it spells something that definitely needs intervention and it needs support so that you're able to communicate with the world around you and you're able to thrive as a human being. So at this point, I had gone basically my whole life thinking that I was either dumb or just really bad at connecting with the world around me. And it was a pretty terrifying feeling. This was the movie of my life. It would be like a scene where the hero of the story finds out that they have abilities that nobody else has. Who do you talk to when you have abilities that nobody else has? Especially if you're terrified of, well, what does it mean if I actually have this thing? Will I never be able to get a job again? Will no one want to marry me because they think that I'm different or a problem? Will I not have friends anymore because they don't know how to talk to me anymore? And in the years since I had that realization, I've talked with enough people to find out that this is a universal fear if you're getting diagnosed later in life. So this is kind of a fun spread of this little kid that grew up into this person who, ended up working for Sesame Workshop, which was a really great job, and I'm sad that I'm not in it anymore. So there's really nothing about these pictures that says autism. You can't detect it by looking at somebody. And one of the most offensive things that I hear on an unfortunately regular basis, you don't look like you have autism. Not like I was trying, not like it's a bad thing, but also my response to that is, well, what am I supposed to look like to you? What is this disability supposed to look like to you? So anyway, the bus trip came and went. I held on to this knowledge without telling anybody about it for almost 2 years. What changed in that course of time that made me decide I really need to get this diagnosed and find out for sure if this is what's going on is I worked for a company where I felt safe. And just to give you a little bit of history, up until this point I struggled pretty spectacularly with jobs. Never really able to stay in a job for too long or get promoted to full-time. And there was always a sense of there was some reason why that everybody else seemed to understand, but I didn't. And that hurts. When you suspect that there is something different about you, and there are snickers, or there are people that look at you funny, or they give each other glances that means something, but you don't know what it means in relation to you, but you also don't understand why you can't seem to advance to the next level in your career. But fortunately for me, I was able to work for a company that served Quakers. And one of the most empowering things about the Quaker religion is this idea that we answer that of God in everyone. I interpret the phrase answering that of God in everyone as respecting that every single person in this world is equal and has dignity and worth. There is no such thing as somebody who is better than somebody else. Just let that sit in the air for a moment. So I got the diagnosis, and ever since that time, I was about 30 when that happened. This was 2015 when that diagnosis was ultimately made. Since that time, I've really been examining, well, how much of who I am is really me, and how much of who I am is part of this disability that I have, or that I've been diagnosed with. And what I came to realize is that a lot of the things that I thought were problems or quirks were actually benefits that I would be able to use in order to connect better to the world around me. So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you about a very small sampling of these quirks that I ultimately think are actually strengths and superpowers. And then after that, any questions you have about my experience to this point or anything else related to the autism spectrum, you're more than welcome to ask me. And if we have time, which I'm hoping we will, we'll be able to talk about, well, what are some of the things you view as quirks in your life that are actually superpowers? And I also want to be very clear that I am not speaking for an entire community today. As the name implies, autism is a spectrum. There are some commonalities. We'll just go back to this previous slide here. There are some things that are frequent occurrences within people who have autism, but the idea that one person is a representative of an entire community is erroneous and dangerous. So I am speaking from my experience today, and you'll probably hear me say a lot based on my experience, so on and so forth. So the first thing I want to talk about with you today is empathy vision. Empathy vision is kind of what I like to describe as shining the bat signal as often as possible. These are things that we need to be aware of. I'm just going to take a quick gander at my notes because there's a lot going on right now. It's about, for me at least, it's about taking on causes and advocating. And in that vein, I am the founder of Get Covered Philly, which is an online campaign that helps to promote the open enrollment period each year. It was started last year by me and a couple of other people because we were very concerned that the open enrollment period had been drastically reduced from a standpoint of publicity, like by 90%, something pretty significant like that. I'm also the organizer of Nonprofit Nerds, which is a meetup group at the Free Library, because I remember how long it took me to find a full-time job and to find a workplace where I felt safe. So in order to prevent that kind of experience for other people, myself and others in the Philadelphia area who are nonprofit professionals or aspiring nonprofit professionals get together and talk about skills, networking, and other things to help them find a job that they really love within the nonprofit field. Because that, for me, is empathy. You want to prevent the pain that you've been holding your whole life before you knew anything was wrong, and making sure you can alleviate as much of that pain as possible, which is kind of nice. You're always aware of how everybody's doing around you, and you're always checking in. Is everybody okay? Does anybody need anything? On the flip side, though, so the format that we're going to take today is looking at a quirk, looking at it as a superpower, but also looking at if we took this superpower too far and we got into the area of villainy, what would this look like? An overuse of the skill of empathy vision would be exhaustion. And I'll be honest, I'm pretty tired very frequently because, among other things, I'm taking in my senses very differently than the rest of us probably are. Lights are brighter to me than most others. Sounds are louder. Usually I can hear air conditioners and rattling noises that my coworkers say, I don't hear anything. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Smells can be much stronger. Touch can be a little bit different. I can't wear velvet or lace because they irritate my skin and drive me absolutely crazy. And the other thing to keep in mind about overusing empathy vision is that when you over-advocate, when you shine the bat signal too much, it pisses people off. So that was one balance that I'm still trying to strike in my life, particularly on my personal social media existence, because I don't want anyone to have the suffering that I had to grow up with before I knew anything was wrong. I don't want anybody to be marginalized or disenfranchised or have their freedoms trampled upon. But I'm still learning you have to really prioritize, well, which cause is most deserving of people's attention right now, and how are you going to present this information in a loving way that doesn't shame, but also gets people to realize you can help with this. All good things to think about. Next one is hypervigilance, also known as being very, very, very observant. There's a running gag in my office that I know anytime somebody's had a haircut. So if I know you, we've met before, I can tell when your hair has changed, which is kind of funny, and I usually make the joke, I haven't decided if I'll use this superpower for good or for evil yet, because there may be evil haircuts out there, and I will find them. So yeah, empathy vision, let's flip the notes here. Hypervigilant, being acutely aware of changes in surroundings, behaviors, and senses. So I can sense when the room gets a little bit colder. I can sense when noises have changed, when the lights are going too high, when they're flickering, things of that nature. But the cool thing about hypervigilance is that it kind of goes hand in hand with empathy vision. Because you care so much about the people around you and making sure that their freedoms are being retained and that they're happy and not suffering the way you remember you used to suffer, you're also hyper aware of when there's changes. Jess, you're not smiling as much today. What's wrong? And while it's nice to be aware of the people you love and the people that are around you, it's also important to keep in mind that taking that too far can be uncomfortable for people. So frequently asking, are you sure you're okay? I noticed that your facial expressions are different today, or that you're in a foul mood. Letting people come to you instead of constantly being hypervigilant and trying to fix everything is definitely a skill that I'm still trying to learn how to use, and I definitely encourage other people know those limits of when you're helping somebody and when you might potentially be taking away their agency, which leads into, so this is my Sherlock slide, because as we know with Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock, he's able to sense little things without people actually telling them, oh, well, I have a dog, I've been unhappily married for 10 years, I'm a scientist, I work for the Queen or whatever. And that's where this particular image comes from, is one of those episodes. So the first two quirks / superpowers that I've mentioned feed perfectly into fearless fixing, the idea that there is always a solution. Everything has the ability to be fixed so that it fits everybody's needs. And problem solving, fearless fixing, whatever you want to call it, is a great skill to have when you're in the working world, because it shows even if there are limitations that are imposed on you, even if there is no budget to do this thing that really needs to get done, you don't accept that. You keep going and you find ways to navigate around that so that you're able to solve the problem or fix whatever it is that you perceive as needing to be fixed, which I think is a really wonderful superpower to have. The problem is that when you seek perfection, when you seek things that should be a certain way all the time, you set up this impossibly high standard that gets really difficult to keep up. And again, because I'm a person on the spectrum, perfection can also be very exhausting. You'll hear me use that word a lot because, unfortunately, a lot of the processes that happen in our day-to-day lives, which many people don't even realize are happening, can actually be very exhausting for people like me, because we're processing information differently and we're trying to interpret what that information means, sometimes while struggling with something called auditory processing disorder. And just a fun fact from this morning, there were two people that I hadn't seen in a while, and I said, so what talk are you giving? And what was funny is I had already looked down at their paper and I could clearly see what the title of their talk was. But for whatever reason, that information didn't get perceived by the senses the way it probably would have if my friend Marty had been looking at their sheets and saying, oh, I see that you're doing a talk about this. For me, it becomes very embarrassing when you're trying to make everybody feel welcome and you're trying to point out the cool things about the people you care about and then realize I look really bad right now because I could have totally read on their paper that they're doing this, and instead I'm asking them about it and they have to explain it to me again, which can be very painful for somebody who is on the spectrum. And the one other important thing that I'll say about fearless fixing before we leave it is that it can be really hard to make peace with the idea that not everything can be fixed. That there are some things that no matter how hard you try to help people's freedoms be retained or try to make people aware of evils that are going on in the world, there are people that either don't want to hear it or just don't want to see a fix to it. They might be vested in an outcome that is beneficial to them. And my superhero icon for fearless fixing is Shuri from Black Panther, which is one of my favorite movies right now and is really good. So while you're trying to be a problem solver or a fixer, keeping in mind that there may not be a solution to this, but it's okay if there is not. So I'm hoping at this point, by everybody seeing anxiety up on the screen, they're like, wow, that's a superpower! I thought that was a crippling thing in my life. And I kind of look at anxiety as something a little bit different. Some people see it as a straitjacket that confines them and keeps them from being able to get things done. I see it as a starter pistol. So it's not something that keeps you insulated or keeps you from going out your front door and making a difference, but it's something that says, you're crippled with fear right now, but I want you to use that in order to motivate you to take this to the next level and overcome your fears. Total transparency, I was terrified about giving this talk this morning. I had been workshopping it for a month and a half with the wonderful Dr. Neil Barden, and thought I was ready with it last night. Get up this morning, I'm like, I don't even know if I want to get out of bed. I don't know if this presentation is going to be any good. But instead of letting that be the straitjacket that says, you're staying home in bed with the cat today and you're not going out your front door, I said, we're going to use this to propel you to the next level because the information you're sharing is valuable. And there are other people out there who are having similar experiences to you and may not know that they have autism spectrum disorder, and you might be able to raise awareness with that today. So my icon for this is Bill Murray's character from What About Bob? Wearing his raincoat even though it's not raining. I like to call myself a pessimistic optimist, so I am constantly in a state of worry that the worst is going to happen, like a guarantee. So as a result of that, I overplan everything. I overplanned this talk. I have to get my directions the night before. I have to lay my clothes out the night before. A lot of planning has to go into my day so that if there's a change in my routine, it's not catastrophic. When you change a routine, or when somebody on the autism spectrum like me is horribly overwhelmed, there is something that can happen called a meltdown. And the easiest way to describe a meltdown is like turning into this guy. This is the Incredible Hulk for people who are following along at home. With a meltdown, there's a couple of different ways you can describe it. For me, it's like opening a steam valve. You've been on your best behavior all day. You've been trying to fix the problems that are around you. You've been trying to not let the feeling of your clothes rubbing against your skin that's really hurting you bother you. You're trying to focus. You're trying to get your job done. You're trying to plan later. You're trying to make sure you're on time for everything. And then something really small might happen. Maybe it's a comment. Maybe it's someone saying, hey, did you forget about our meeting? And that's all it takes for the release that needs to happen. For me personally, a meltdown can look like intense crying, like I can't do anything, I have to stop and just sob and cry it out until it passes. Other times it might manifest itself as yelling or just being really, really, really irritable. The thing that's kind of unfortunate about a meltdown is you can't stop it once it's in progress. It's like being the Incredible Hulk. He can't stop being who he is because it's scaring the bejesus out of everybody around him. He kind of has to let that ride itself out. Fortunately, after getting my diagnosis, I was able to work with a really wonderful therapist who gave me a lot of good coping strategies. to be able to identify, well, what physical reactions do you start to have when you know that you're getting to that point and you need to derail it? What are things you can do to soothe yourself? Where's my little goodie bag here? So one thing I typically do when I go to conferences like this is usually I have a coloring book and something silly like cat ears or an emergency tutu, so that if I'm running late or I feel like I'm about to let people down because my disability is interfering with my way of being able to proceed and function normally. You good, Marty? Okay, good. We got to put that picture in the presentation. So having something that kind of diffuses that tension, like an emergency tutu or cat ears or something like that, it helps the people around you laugh. And when you're feeding off of laughter and happy feelings, that can really make a huge difference in diffusing tension that might actually feed into your meltdown. So that is why I'm now wearing cat ears in front of you. The last quirk that I'll tell you about that I think is one of the most important superpowers that we can have as a people is resilience. I learned a lot about resiliency when I worked at Women Against Abuse. It's the idea that you develop coping mechanisms or the sense of hope even when things are going massively wrong around you, or you have experienced a tremendous trauma in your life like domestic violence or abuse in some way, shape, or form. It's the idea of being determined and having an almost obnoxious sense of hope. Even when the walls are coming down around you and you really don't know how you're going to build them back up again, you still have that little pocket of hope that lives inside of you and keeps you going and makes you persistent. And the one person who I think is a perfect model of resilience and determination right now is our beloved Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the great dissenter. Even when she is on a Supreme Court that is predominantly conservative at this point, she is still the person who is advocating and speaking up for the people who can't, because she knows that by writing dissenting decisions, this is information that will help people years from now. Even if it cannot help right now, having that hope that this could open a door that needs to be opened badly later is something important to keep in mind. And she's also a great model of determination because, gosh darn it, she does a plank better than I do, and I'm turning 34 tomorrow. So if you can plank like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you're doing something right. So let's shift it to you guys for a second. What can you do if you have things that you see as quirks but are actually superpowers? How do you make them work with the life that you already have? My first suggestion is please get a sidekick. And the way you can think about a sidekick, it can be having somebody like Robin, somebody who fights in the trenches with you, shares the same experience as you do. If you're somebody who has left an abusive relationship behind, maybe there's somebody out there who has also left abuse behind, and you guys are there for each other to say, you can do this. On the flip side, if you don't want a Robin in your life, but you need somebody like Alfred, who was Bruce Wayne's butler and the person who kind of looked after him as he grew up, Alfred is more to be like a gentle voice and saying, this is how this is going to work. You can do this. And for me, an Alfred can be a therapist, it can be a professional mentor, it can be somebody who they care about you, but they don't have a huge bias that would prevent them from being able to advise you in a way that you need to be advised. Step 2, know your kryptonite. One of the most empowering things that my therapist ever had me do was really boil down all the emotions that I'm experiencing when I'm about to have a meltdown. 99.9% of them all lead back to the same thing. I'm afraid of being alone. I have this disability. I might not be able to get married because of it, or so I thought. I have this disability. I might not be able to find a job ever again because people are going to be too scared to hire somebody like me. So I don't have money. I don't have a husband. I'm going to be homeless. It just spirals until we boil it down to, I'm afraid of being alone. And once you know that that is the fear that cripples you, that makes you want to go into a straitjacket, but then you have to use it as a starter pistol, identifying that thing by name and saying it out loud and owning that is profoundly powerful and can really do you a world of good, so that you know in your interactions, I'm terrified of being alone. So When I'm talking to this person who is challenging me about my work, I recognize that the feelings that are bubbling up in me are not because they are not doing their job or they're bad people. I feel challenged right now. I feel uncomfortable because they're criticizing my work. What if my boss hears that and that criticism gets me fired? If I get fired and I can't find a job, I'm not going to have any money. If I don't have any money, I'm not going to have a home for my cat and I. And if I don't have a home and I'm out on the streets, I might be in danger. And if I'm in danger, I might die alone. And if anyone is interested in getting some of the worksheets that my therapist gave me about how to analyze the feelings that are, or the steps that are surrounding a feeling you might have, I'm happy to dig that out and get it to you because it's really, really helpful. And then step 3 for how to survive with superhero powers without trying, remember that you're not the only mutant. What I mean by that is that there's that cliched phrase, everybody is fighting a battle you know nothing about. That shit's true. There are people out there who have autism that have not had that realization yet. Maybe they will, maybe they will not. Being kind to people who are acting in a way that doesn't make sense to you is imperative, because you really have no idea what transpired in that person's life before they got into a room with you. This is especially true if you work in customer service, if you're a supervisor. Always assume that if somebody is angry or behaving towards you in a way that does not make any sense, always assume positive intent and be kind to them. That is the nicest thing that you can do to somebody who might have something that is different about them that they haven't been able to put a name on yet. And one quote that I want you all to remember is from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood host. He had said that anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable is manageable. So the moment you put a name on something, you're able to understand it better and then get the help that you need in order to address it in your life. So I definitely am, for me personally, it was important to get diagnosed with autism, but I definitely hold space and am very understanding of people who do not feel comfortable making that step happen. And this is Elle Woods saying, first impressions are not always correct, which is absolutely true. There have been so many times where I thought, if people just knew who I was, if they knew that I was about to have a meltdown and that's why I had to run out of a room before they could contact me, or the reason I didn't write back to their email was because I was so overwhelmed with all these things in my life that I just didn't know where to begin, and I did let the straitjacket come in for a little while. And this last slide here before we jump into Q&A is if you witness somebody having a meltdown or you suspect that they're having a meltdown, particularly if it's an adult, first and foremost, you want to make sure that you are safe and that if they're about to be in a dangerous situation, trying to remove those dangers. If they're about to lose it near a train track, for example, making sure you're kind of helping them so that nothing awful happens to them. But aside from that, if there is no immediate danger, you want to validate their feelings. You want to say, yeah, it's totally okay to get angry right now. I totally understand, even if you don't. Just letting them know that they're not irrational for feeling the way they are at that moment. And then helping them feel safe on their terms. I will say that there are some people on the autism spectrum who do not like to be hugged or touched unless they really know you and they really trust you. The last thing you want to do is hug them or restrain them in any way that could be dangerous for you and that could be very dangerous for them. But to say, your feelings are totally valid. If you need to get this out of your system, I'm right here. You might not see me because you're in the throes of this meltdown, but I'm standing right over here and I'm not going anywhere. Now, if you are uncomfortable by an adult screaming or having a really severe reaction like that, leave the room. You're not abandoning them, but by staying there and trying to, having these feelings that they are now picking up on can make it monumentally worse. And then when they're calm again, helping them create something called a safety plan, or even just having things with you, like I've got my cat ears on right now, I've got my adult coloring book. There are things you can do to head off a meltdown, and there is no right solution for everybody. Each person has their own solution that they need to use in order to make sure that they are safe and that they're not going into that territory. So that's essentially my presentation. As promised, I'd love to open up the floor to questions. And I will say, you can ask me any questions you have. If there are questions you don't feel safe asking somebody who has autism, but you'd like to ask me, if I can't answer it, I'll let you know that. But please feel free. Yes?
I want to thank you for putting on this talk. It's perfect. I feel like this has been my whole life summed up in a PowerPoint. And growing up, I had multiple learning disabilities, and the diagnosis I got as a child was just, my parents never wanted me to end up in a diagnosis. In school, and the doctor is always kind of just learning disabilities. And so as an adult, and learning so much on my own about the different disabilities that are out there, and then finding out about autism spectrum, I realized much later in life, I'm probably on the spectrum, but have never formally got tested to find out. But almost every slide you touched on has been like some bane in my life where I've been like, how do I explain this to people? I'm like the Incredible Hulk. How do I explain this to people? I'm, dealing with this situation, or I have this ability to be super organized, but then I'm also too clean and it's annoying and I bother people. And there's endless stories like this throughout my life. And you did a great job really telling that narrative of people that make look normal, and everyone thinks, oh, it's just fine, no big deal.
Yeah.
But internally, I feel like I know I'm different. Like I know I'm a mutant, and that's something I've been calling myself for a long time because of Marvel's X-Men, and I resonated with each one of those characters. That superpower they have, oftentimes is a disability, and they go throughout life having this superpower that like it's shitty, I hate it, it doesn't really help me. I touch anything electronic, it blows up, or I kiss anyone and they drain the life out of them and they die. But then learning ways to use those superpowers for something good, like you talked about here in this talk, is really compelling. I love that narrative. And I've been trying to explain that to people, but it doesn't often come out the same way.
Yeah.
And I have a question about when you got diagnosed, why did you go to the doctor? And what did they do to get that test, and how does that go on your record, and how does that affect your life from having a permanent diagnosis?
Yeah.
And what should I be aware of, and where can I go, and what are the different things I should know?
Okay. So I'll tell you a little bit about my diagnosis process. When I finally made the decision to get a diagnosis, the first step that you have to take is you have to talk to your primary care physician, which sucked because my primary care physician took a look at me and said, I've never had a patient ask me about this before. So it's like, great. So you have to start there because depending on your insurance plan, your primary care physician may need to get a referral for you so that you can formally go to somebody and get that diagnosis. What ended up happening for me is I had to do a Google search, and it took a couple of weeks to really identify who takes my insurance, who is within public transit or driving distance if I was able to get somebody else to drive me because I don't like driving very much. And the actual test that I underwent was a series of questions. How do you feel about this type of thing? When you were a child, did any of these types of symptoms happen? With little kids who are getting diagnosed, they are able to be observed in an environment where their parents can watch them, or the observer who's doing the test can actually take a look at, well, how are they interacting with other people? That doesn't exist really for adults, and unfortunately there are not that many resources out there for adults who want to know, is this what's going on with me, and how do I know for sure? And as a consequence, let me just go back to our slide from the beginning, when you don't know that you're looking for these signs as something of a bigger issue or something that needs support, you miss them. And then it's hard to kind of articulate when you're meeting with a professional, well, which one of these things points to autism? And the other thing I'll mention is that a lot of tests related to how to diagnose somebody with autism spectrum disorder is based primarily on diagnosing little boys. Little girls are, from a young age, conditioned to follow directions, not be as loud as boys, be good. And when you have that kind of dynamic, it hurts girls not being able to get a diagnosis when they're little, but then going through life like I did, and then finding out later, these are all symptoms of something bigger that I need to talk to a doctor about. After the diagnosis, I was told that I didn't need to be on medication, but it was probably a good idea to meet with a therapist on a regular basis. So that process took about a month and a half because I hate going to therapy, as I know a lot of people probably do, but now I'm pretty cool with it. It's actually a really nice way to talk to somebody who doesn't have a bias, who is able to kind of look at what you're saying and say, try looking at it this way. It's probably not the way you think it is. And once I was able to go to a therapist, I was able to get strategies for stopping meltdowns. I was able to reframe how I was seeing a lot of the world and realize that a lot of the things that you perceive as people doing to you, like going out of their way to make your life miserable, probably not the case. There is probably nobody waking up first thing in the morning and saying, I wonder how I can screw Marta Rusek over today. Like, I just want to think about that today. Not the case. So ever since then, I've just been seeing a therapist, and whenever things come up, I try to document them as best I can. Work-wise, there have been a couple of little strategies that I use in order to function more effectively with my coworkers. One of them is whenever I have a meeting where a lot of information is being discussed because I struggle with auditory processing, I will take detailed notes, and then I will send an email with all of those notes to the person or people I was meeting with a little note at the top that says, here's what I recorded during our meeting. Can you please clarify anything that doesn't seem right or that I misheard entirely? That's been very effective. So having little workarounds like that are basically not declaring, I have autism, I can't remember all the things we talk about. That's my autism voice. But being able to say, there are some shortcomings that I have. There are obstacles that I face in the workplace, but here's what I can do to make sure that it's not impacting the work I'm doing. Here's what I can do to strengthen the relationships around me rather than isolate myself or say, I just can't do this, I have this thing. Yes?
So something I'd like to add to that is, so I have ADHD with a reading comprehension issue.
Okay.
And one of the biggest issues is explaining it to other people. Right? Like, because everyone around you is like, well, you're doing so well. And I'm like, yeah, but like, I've read the thing 12 times and still have no idea what it says. Right? And I found with either finding therapists or psychiatrists or doctors or whatever, is just trying to explain what you're feeling, because it's like, it's like, this doesn't make, like, when you say it out loud, it's like, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this?
Yeah, had that happen this morning.
Right, like, it's really, like, that's the hardest thing to get over.
I have the same disability with reading comprehension. Right. It takes me an hour to read one page of a book.
Yeah.
And I listen to audiobooks now, and I'm like 100 plus books in, almost 200 books. And for 8 years, in my life, like, I went through all of school failing and realizing the education system's broke for people like us. And it's just not designed for anyone with disability.
Yeah, I mean, another thing is I've been put into more of a strategy writing position at work, which is totally where like, yes, my brain thinks that way, and I leverage all my ADHD, pitfalls to make that job really well, and yet I can't write anything. But yet everyone's like, but you in the meeting world, I'm like, yeah, those are two different things. Those work, but like being able to explain it is typically harder. But once you can explain it and have a cohesive language, it's actually pretty easy.
And getting people to believe you.
Yes.
It's not even just about explaining. Like, people just go, you know what, you're perfectly fine. You can read. I see you read, and like, there's nothing wrong. Like, you're lying. They don't. It's like, what do I prove it? Do I just, change who I am and prove it to you that I can just read? I don't know what I can do, and it's terrible. It's like proving that you're not you. And people don't realize that when they're saying that, how hurtful it is and how much anxiety that brings. And it's like,
like I fooled you, and and that was something that I really struggled with before the diagnosis. Is I like to help people around me. I like everybody to be happy and comfortable. But then I'll have a meltdown, or I'll have a moment where I am so overwhelmed, I might just shut down and walk away. And I found out later that from former coworkers of mine that was disturbing to them. I'm functional one moment, and then suddenly I'm not. You must be lying. You must be hiding something. You must not be who you presented yourself to be. And that's the one thing that hurts about having an accessibility obstacle or having a disability, however you define it, because that's what matters. Your disability is not the problem. It's how the world around you perceives it and treats you that is the problem. You are wonderful and fine the way you are. It hurts that we have to work 5 times as hard to function in it. And that I'm never going to be okay with. I'll find ways to explain it or think of strategies so that in my job as a communications manager, I am doing well by my company that I work for and by the clients that I help as a contractor. But that stuff still hurts a lot. That never goes away. So you're doing as best you can, and you should keep doing that. Did I see another hand up? Looks like we're a little after 1, so unfortunately we won't get to the Quirks portion or Quirks as superpowers, but if you want to talk to me afterwards about that, I'm here for you. If you want to email me or talk to me through Facebook and Twitter, this is my information above. Thank you so much for coming in today.